It's finally December, and with many a gift giving holiday coming up, you may be wanting to get the book lover in your life some books. Sounds reasonable, right? Didn't I just put out a video 2 days ago saying that that's maybe not the best idea? Yes, I did do that. I just think that buying books for book lovers can be a little bit of a landmine sometimes, simply because most book lovers that I know have no problem sourcing the books that they want to read. However, I do think there's a time and place for gifting books, so today I'm going to give you some ideas. I've got some genre-specific recommendations if you know that they like certain genres, but we're going to look at stuff that has sort of broad appeal, but hopefully not the obvious choices. I should put a disclaimer though that if someone has a specific book wish list, it's really important to use that. A lot of people who read a lot use apps like Goodreads or Storygraph or Fable to track their reading. So see if you can get access to that app and find them. And they should have a want to read or TBR list, TBR meaning to be read, that will help you find books that they have actively identified as wanting to read. This is a lot more reliable than just looking at someone's bookshelf, because a lot of people read in different formats. Maybe they read a lot on Kindle, or they listen to a lot of audiobooks like I do, or also like I do, they use the library a lot. I've read tons of books that aren't on my shelves, and so if you just looked at my shelves, it would be very easy for you to get me something that I don't own but I have actually read. So those reading tracker apps are a really good way to help avoid that. But let's say you can't find anything there. I have got 11 recommendations for you. So let's jump straight in with my favorite book from a couple of years ago, and that is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This book was really popular, so it's possible that someone's already read it, but I think people thought that this book was more literary than it actually is. This book is about Sam and Sadie, who are childhood friends who bond over playing video games together in the hospital, and then they reunite when they are university students in Boston, and they start making video games together, and it follows them throughout their lives, looks at their relationship with each other, their relationships with other people, and it's a really, really beautiful story. There's a chapter in here that made me sob like a child, and you might hear video games and think that that's going to rule out a lot of people in your life who aren't going to appreciate geek culture, but I assure you that's not the role of video games in this story. They're more just there as another storytelling device. The games that they're making at different points in their lives are incredibly revealing about the characters and their relationships and their mental states and their emotional arcs that they're going on. I think the same thing that makes a good gift book is also what makes a good book club book, which is the ability to read it and form strong opinions. And I don't know anyone who's read this book and doesn't have some very strong opinions about it. So I think it's a really good choice. Another book that's been really popular amongst sort of the book talk, booktube communities, but maybe less so outside of those, is If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. This is about a group of Shakespeare students at an elite conservatory. So they are hardcore studying Shakespeare in a very, very small group, and one of their group dies, and it kind of unfolds the way a Shakespearean tragedy would, where relationships and individuals and mental states start to break down and unwind. It's considered dark academia, but I think the layering of Shakespeare into it doesn't feel overly pretentious. It just feels like it's got this incredible sense of longing, and it also has an ending that made me gasp. I think this would be a really good one to give to someone, again, who's outside of those online bookish communities, because I do think it's got broad appeal, and I'm surprised that it's not been more popular amongst the general population. It's never been an airport book, and I don't really understand why not. Next up, we have The End of the World Running Club by Adrian J. Walker. And this is about a man named Edgar who is with his family somewhere in the north of the UK. It might be North England, it might be Scotland. And while he's there, the world starts to end. I actually can't even remember exactly what it is. Maybe there's like meteors or something. But all of a sudden, his family is hundreds of miles away from him in Cornwall, and he needs to get to them very, very quickly or he's going to be left behind. And so he sets out on foot to try to get to his family in time. And as he's traversing the countryside, he's encountering the best and the worst of humankind. He's not a particularly good husband or father, but all of a sudden getting to his family is the only thing that matters to him. I think this book has universal appeal. It is almost like, I would say, a more thrilling version of The Road. Definitely not as depressing. Like, obviously that book is seminal and is revered for a reason. reason, but this book is a lot longer and it goes a lot more into character, but you get a lot of the same kind of atmospheric and like best and worst of humanity kinds of experiences as you're reading it. I shared this with my mother-in-law when I read it back in like 2017, 2018, and she really enjoyed it as well. So again, the kind of book that's got really broad appeal. And last in this category, I want to recommend to you The Lightness by Emily Temple. This is a book that I read several years ago and it has really stuck with me. It's a sort of upmarket, almost literary fiction novel about a girl who is searching for information about her father because he left home for a meditation retreat in the mountains and then just never came back. So she ends up getting to go to this meditation retreat sanctuary place as part of like a troubled girls initiative. I think they call it Buddhist boot camp for bad girls. And while she's there, she's not only trying to uncover information about her father, but she also is getting to know the girls there, some of the staff. There's some weird relationships going on, and some of the girls are trying to learn to levitate. And it gets really weird. I love books about like young girls that are just being really weird. That sort of weird intensity of the relationships of young girls and how fraught they are and how angsty they are. And all of that layered in with this familial complexity and this setting and the whole like Buddhist overtones. It creates this really strange, almost surreal reading experience, and it does get a little bit dark, and I don't know, I really loved it. I think this is a really good gift for someone who really likes lit fic, but maybe reads their books a little bit more slowly. They really like to savor them. I think this would be a really good book for someone like that. Next, I want to talk about some science fiction choices. And when I say science fiction, you might be thinking like spaceships and robots, and I've got a robot and some time machines in this stack, but I'm not a big, like, super geeky science fiction fan. That's not my preferred type of science fiction. What we're going to talk about is more like dystopian or speculative science fiction, which is a lot more accessible, a lot more contemporary feeling, a lot less heavy on the science. And we're going to start with a bit of a deep cut, which is Wool by Hugh Howey. This came out well over a decade ago, and it was originally published as a bunch of shorter bits, but it's been since compiled into this novel. Some places call it like the omnibus. This book was pretty recently adapted into, I think, an Apple TV show called Silo, and it's about a bunch of people who live in a silo where the outside world has been, well, some disaster has happened and it is a ravaged wasteland. And the silo is mostly underground except for the very top. And when I say a lot of people live there, I mean like thousands and thousands of people. It's a whole like city underground. And when you commit a crime, you get sent outside. And specifically, you get sent outside to clean the cameras that allow people to see at that top level the outside as a reminder of what it is that they're up against if they ever wanted to leave. At the very, very beginning of the book, we are calling into question why the silos exist. Is it actually a ravaged wasteland outside, or is there some greater conspiracy going on? It's very dystopian, but unlike things like The Hunger Games or Divergent or other sort of YA dystopias, this is a lot more adult. Not in terms of content, it doesn't necessarily get darker, it's not got explicit content, but the characters are older and it's a lot more focused on the community, the politics, and so I think it would appeal to a lot of people that might have felt like those choices were a bit too juvenile for their tastes. The next one I want to talk about is A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. Now, Becky Chambers does a lot of spaceship science fiction, but this is the first in a duology called the Monk and Robot duology, which are novellas, so they are very, very short, and they are about a world very similar to ours, but where hundreds of years ago, all robots gained sentience and decided they didn't want to work for humans anymore. They just got up and they walked out into the wilderness and they said, "Don't call us, we'll call you. We'll check in a little bit and see how you're doing." And by a little bit, they meant hundreds of years. So it's now been hundreds of years and humans have gone back to a much more like agrarian kind of existence, a lot more lo-fi. And this book follows Sibling Dex, sibling being an honorific for a monk, similar to brother or sister. And Sibling Dex has decided that they want to be a tea monk, which means they pedal their little tea cart around from village to village and serve people tea based on whatever needs they have. They've had a bad day, if they're sick, if they've got a backache, that kind of thing. They've got different teas they can serve. It's very cute. And while they're doing this, they get an urge to go on a little bit more adventure. So they kind of go off the beaten path. And as they do, they encounter the robot that has been sent back to check in on humanity. And this robot wants to know what humanity needs from the robots. And Sibling Dex has to facilitate getting an answer to that question. I love this book as sort of a gateway to science fiction because it's very, very accessible. The language is very contemporary. The characters are very relatable. They feel very modern. It's the kind of thing that just has a lot of lovely life lessons and lessons about being human in it. If you remember those like Chicken Soup for the Soul books that were really popular in the 90s, this is like Chicken Soup for the Soul in science fiction form. So I highly recommend it. It is part of a duology, and the second book is the same length. So if you wanted to get both, it's a really good option, but even just the first one I think would be a lovely gift. And then the last science fiction recommendation that I have for you is Just One Damn Thing After Another by Jodi Taylor. Full transparency, this is the first book in a series that is currently like 14 or 15 books long. However, I think it's a good reading experience in and of itself. And the Chronicles of St. Mary's series follows Madeline Maxwell, aka Max, who in this book is a new initiate to the St. Mary's Institute for Historical Research. So it's got this kind of like university academia feeling. It's not academia because they're not teaching, but it's this research institute. But it turns out that they don't just research the past, they actually time travel to the past in order to observe historical events. Observation only, no interference, which of course always goes perfectly to plan because why wouldn't it? This book is hilarious. It is very British humor, but very, very funny. Madeline Maxwell is one of the most relatable protagonists that I have ever read in my life. And it is both funny and action-packed. Like you are on the edge of your seat throughout this book. There's great relationships. The historical settings are so immersive. Character development is great. It's got a hilarious cast of side characters. And I just want to read you the last paragraph on the back of the book. Follow the tea-soaked disaster magnates of St. Mary's as they rattle around history, because wherever the historians go, chaos is sure to follow. And that is exactly what this book feels like. And I know it's science fiction because of the time travel, but it's done in a very accessible way. And I genuinely don't know a single person in my life that I would not recommend this book to. I feel like it's in that one tiny little spot where the Venn diagram of everybody's reading tastes overlaps. It's right there in the middle. Now I've got a fantasy recommendation for you, and this is actually a newer book, and this is called A Dark and Secret Magic by Wallace Kinney. It's a cozy romantic fantasy novel about Hecate Goodwin, aka Kate, who is a hedge witch in a coven in Massachusetts, and she's getting ready for Samhain or Halloween to host the celebration with her coven. It's also a big birthday for her because her magic is getting ready to be contained to her specialty in order to strengthen it. But as she's getting ready for the festivities and for the ritual, Matthew comes along, and he is from a rival coven on the West Coast, and he comes with a lot of accusations and questions about her upbringing, about her mother who died 6 months prior, and Kate really wants to ignore him and get on with her life, but he's got a point sometimes, and she keeps finding out new things about her own powers and seeing references to this entity called the King Below. She doesn't really know what to make of all of it. I love this book because it is quite cozy. I mean, there's like a pumpkin carving contest in it. So it's not super high fantasy. It's very relatable, but the world building in it and the exploration of the magic and the mythology is also so strong. So I think whether people are more into high fantasy or cozy fantasy or urban fantasy, I just feel like, again, this is going to appeal to most kinds of fantasy readers. It does have a very strong romantic plot, so you want to make sure that the person you're giving it to is okay with that. Some fantasy readers don't want romance anywhere near their fantasy. But it's one of my favorite fantasies that I've read in a long time, and that's saying something because I've read a lot of good fantasy this year. Speaking of romance, I have a romance recommendation for you, and that is Do I Know You by Emily Wibberley and Austin Siegman Broca. They're most popular for their book before this called The Roughest Draft, which I think a lot of romance readers have read, but I haven't seen as many people talk about this one, which I'm really surprised by. I love this. I think it's deeply romantic. It's about a married couple who are not doing very well, and they go on an anniversary trip and somehow end up with 2 different rooms booked for them. And they decide that they're going to stay apart and pretend to not know each other and kind of start dating each other on this trip, which sounds so cheesy, but it is executed so brilliantly. Like I said, it's incredibly romantic. I think that most romance is obviously the getting together to begin with. And so how do you create tension in a genre that requires a happily ever after, but they're already married at the beginning of it? How do you do that? And yet they manage to do it brilliantly. I think this duo is particularly good at dual point of view novels because the points of view feel so distinct. And I've always wondered if they actually, one of them writes one of them writes the other, because they feel like such different people. And there are two incredibly strong character arcs as a result. I feel like if you're going to gift a romance book to a romance reader, you want it to be something that's going to be different than other things that they've read. And I think this one is really different than anything else I've read, but it's also one of my favorites. Two more to go, and we're going to go with a nonfiction recommendation, and that is The Shapeless Unease by Samantha Harvey. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because she just won the Booker Prize for her novel Orbital that came out this year. But this book is a little bit older, and it is a very short memoir. The subtitle is My Year in Search of Sleep, and basically she had this very sudden onset insomnia that resulted in an entire year of extreme sleep deprivation. And in this book, she explores creativity and humanity and sanity in a way that is so poignant. I'm not a huge nonfiction and memoir girly, but I loved this book because it just explores the human condition in such a succinct and yet powerful way. When I read this book for the first time, I put a reminder in my calendar to reread it every year because it was that good. It's always my first nonfiction recommendation, but I also don't think it's so widely read that most people will have read it. So I think if you know someone who does enjoy memoirs or who does enjoy nonfiction, this is a really good opportunity to give them something they'll enjoy. And again, because it's so short, it's a really low commitment. And then because I'm an author myself, I really wanted to end the video with a recommendation for a book to buy for your writer friends. And that's Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. Some of them will probably have read this, but having a copy is brilliant because Anne Lamott, who is a famous author, articulates some advice, not just about the creative process, but also about life in general, in a way that is so relatable and so accessible. I think a lot of times advice can feel either super practical and pragmatic or super aspirational. And I feel like Anne Lamott finds this nice balance where it's not an overly instructional book. It's definitely written more like a memoir with some pieces of advice layered in, but it also doesn't feel overly aspirational. It feels very relatable and like you can action a lot of the things you learn from it immediately. If I had to get rid of all but one of my books on writing, and I have quite the collection, this is the one I would keep. So I highly recommend this as a gift for the writer friends in your life. While gifting books can be a little bit of a minefield, it is the obvious choice if you have a book lover in your life. So I hope you found some good recommendations here. And if you have decided that you don't want to buy books or you'd like to buy them a bookish gift to go with the book you're getting for them, make sure you check out my other video. I've got 80 plus ideas for bookish gifts that you can give to them this holiday season. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!